The wind screamed first. It came hours before the snow. A high, thin wail from the north that made the cattle restless and the older hands curse. Luke McCall, at 24, was younger than most of them, but he knew the sound. It was the sound of a season turning, of the sky closing a door. They were driving 300 head across northern Wyoming, pushing hard for the railhead before the first heavy snows of 1885. The sky had been a bruised, heavy purple all morning. Then the wind came. Then the world vanished. It was not a gentle snow. It was a wall of white ice, driven horizontal by a gale that stole the breath and stung the eyes shut. The herd bellowed, panicked, and turned south, tails to the wind. Luke, riding drag, was instantly enveloped. He pulled his kerchief over his nose, bent low against the neck of his horse, Old Patch, and tried to keep the stragglers in sight, but there was nothing to see. The world had shrunk to a 10-foot circle of swirling, blinding white. He heard a shout. Maybe it was Jed, maybe just the wind mocking him. He called back, and the sound was ripped from his mouth. He was alone. He trusted the horse. Old Patch knew the work, but the ground, frozen hard and now slick with ice, was treacherous. For an hour, or maybe 3, they pushed forward, Luke having no idea if he was heading toward the herd or deeper into the empty wilderness. The cold was a physical weight, settling deep in his chest. His fingers, even in thick gloves, were numb. His feet were stones. Then it happened, a sudden dip in the terrain, a sheet of ice hidden beneath a fresh drift. Old Patch's front legs went out. The horse screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound of animal terror and breaking bone. Luke was thrown clear, landing hard on his left side, his ankle twisting beneath him with a sickening pop of ligament. He lay in the snow for a moment, stunned, the wind howling over him. The pain in his ankle was a dull, hot throb. He pushed himself up. Old Patch was trying to stand, one foreleg dangling at an angle that was wrong, unnatural. The white snow around the break was already darkening with blood. Luke swallowed the sickness that rose in his throat. He limped over to the horse, his hand reaching for the worn bridle. Old Patch's eyes were wide, white-rimmed with panic. "Easy, boy," Luke whispered, his voice cracking. "Easy now." He stroked the horse's neck, his numb fingers fumbling for the clasp of the saddlebag. He pulled out the heavy Colt. His hands were shaking so badly, it took him 2 tries to cock the hammer. He looked away from the horse's trusting eye and pressed the cold barrel just behind the ear. "Sorry, Patch," he breathed. The shot was shockingly loud. A flat crack that seemed to punch a hole in the storm, only to be swallowed by it an instant later. The horse collapsed, the tension going out of it all at once. Silence returned. Save for the wind, Luke McCall was now a man on foot, injured, in the middle of a blizzard. Miles from anything, he stood over the body of his horse for a long time. He wanted to take the saddle, the bedroll, the rifle in its scabbard. But the pain from his ankle was sharp now, a blade twisting with every attempt to put weight on it. He could not carry the gear. He pulled the Colt, checked its load, and shoved it into the waistband of his trousers. He took a small tin of jerky from the saddlebag and left the rest. Leaving the rifle felt like leaving a part of himself. But he had no choice. He turned his back on the horse and began to walk. He had no direction. The sun was gone. The mountains were gone. There was only the white, stinging drive of the snow and the rising drifts. He limped badly, his ankle sending fire up his leg. He fell. He got up. He fell again. He thought about the other men. They were probably safe, hunkered down in the lee of a canyon wall, boiling coffee and waiting for it to blow over. He thought about his brother, Micah, who had died in a place just as cold, but not from the weather. Luke had survived that, and he would survive this. He was a quiet man, Luke, and his observations were usually kept to himself. His current observation was that the world was empty and it wanted him dead. Hours passed. The dim gray light of afternoon began to fail, turning the white snow to a deathly blue. He was stumbling, half blind, his body shutting down. The cold was no longer sharp. It was a heavy, sleepy numbness, This is how it happens, he thought. You just stop. You sit down. You sleep. Then he saw it. It was not a light. It was the memory of a light. A tiny, rectangular smudge of yellow, impossibly far away, flickering in the maelstrom. He stopped, staring, convinced it was his mind freezing, playing tricks. It disappeared as the snow thickened, then returned, faint but steady. A cabin. It gave him a new purpose. He locked his eyes on the light and forced his legs to move. It was on the edge of a windswept valley, an isolated homestead that seemed to be daring the storm to take it. Who would build a life out here, on the edge of nowhere? It took him another hour to reach it. He fell twice more. The last time just 20 yards from the door, and had to crawl on his hands and knees up to the rough-hewn porch. The cabin was small, built of thick logs, chinked tight against the wind. A thin ribbon of smoke tore from the chimney. He pulled himself up by the doorframe and knocked, his frozen glove making a dull, heavy thud. For a moment, nothing. Then, a deep, menacing growl from within. A dog. A shadow moved behind the frosted window pane. He heard the metallic scrape of a bar being lifted. The door opened a crack, maybe 3 inches. He saw the barrel of a rifle first, steady and aimed right at his chest. Behind it, in the sliver of darkness, was the eye of a woman. "Go on," a voice said. It was low, rough. "Ma'am?" Luke gasped, his words slurring. "Storm. Caught me. My horse. Broke his leg. Just you." "Yes, ma'am, just me." He leaned against the frame, the last of his strength failing. "I think my ankle's broken. I'll freeze." The eye in the darkness studied him. He could feel the suspicion, the cold reluctance. The dog growled again, a low rumble in its chest. "I don't keep company," the woman said flatly. "I'm not asking for charity." Luke pushed out, desperate. "I can work. I can chop wood. Fix anything you got. Just till the storm passes. Please." He saw her look past him, into the blue-black chaos of the evening, as if searching for others. She saw nothing but the snow. She looked back at him. He met her gaze, or tried to. He was a young man, but he looked old in that moment, ice caked in his eyebrows and beard, his face gray with exhaustion, the rifle barrel lowered, just an inch. "You bring trouble," she said. It was not a question. "No, ma'am, just myself." The door opened wider. "Wipe your feet," she said, and stepped back. "And don't you bleed on my floor." Luke nearly fell inside. The warmth hit him like a physical blow, staggering him. The cabin was one room, clean but sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A bed was tucked in the corner, and a small table with 2 chairs sat in the middle. A massive, brindle-colored dog with one floppy ear stood near the hearth, its eyes fixed on him, a low growl still vibrating in its chest. The woman pushed the door shut, the wind fighting her, and dropped the heavy bar back into place. She was not old, maybe 30. She was tall for a woman, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was strong-boned and handsome, but worn, as if she had been looking at a hard sun for too long. Her eyes were the most startling thing, a clear, cold gray, and they missed nothing. She wore a simple wool dress, faded from washing. "Grit," she said to the dog, and it reluctantly quieted, though it never looked away from Luke. "Cot's in the corner," she said, gesturing with her chin. "You can put your things there." Lost my things with the horse," Luke said, easing himself down onto the folded cot. The relief of being off his foot was so great he almost passed out. She looked at his sodden trousers, the ice melting into dark pools on her clean floor. She grunted, then turned, grabbed a ragged blanket from a chest, and tossed it at him. "Get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death," she said. "And I'll look at that ankle. But if you're lying, if there's men coming behind you, Grit'll tear your throat out before I even raise my rifle." "No one's coming," Luke said, his voice hoarse. He believed it. She was Clara Hayes. He learned her name the next morning. And she was a widow. This, she did not tell him. But the cabin told him. It was a place built for two but lived in by one. There was a stillness to it, an emptiness that the storm outside only seemed to amplify. She lived alone, with her dog, and she was visibly, painfully wary of company. Luke, true to his word, offered his labor. His ankle was not broken, just badly sprained. Clara had wrapped it tightly with a strip of linen, her touch surprisingly gentle but firm. Impersonal. "You're lucky," she'd said. "Rested a day. You'll walk on it. Now. You said you'd work." "Yes, ma'am." Wood piles low, and the latch on the shed's busted. The storm did not pass. For 3 days, the world remained white and screaming. Luke spent his time outside, wrapped in an old oilskin slicker she'd loaned him, one that was clearly built for a much larger man. He limped to the wood pile, splitting logs until his shoulders burned and his hands were raw, the steady rhythm of the axe a comfort. He fixed the shed latch. He re-chinked a spot on the west wall where the wind was whistling through. He was quiet, and she was observant. Clara watched him from the small window. He was young, she saw that, but he wasn't soft. He worked without complaint, his movements economical, even with the limp. He never spoke unless spoken to. He was a shadow in her small home, a masculine presence that was both unsettling and, she was shamed to admit, interesting. The tension between them was thick, sharp as the cold. Clara was blunt, her words clipped. "You eat a lot for a small man," she said on the second night, slamming a bowl of rabbit stew in front of him. "I work hard, ma'am," Luke replied, not looking up. "I've seen men work hard. Usually means they're running from something." "Usually," Luke agreed, and kept eating. Her probing was met with his silence. This seemed to frustrate her, and strangely, to intrigue her. She was guarded, a fortress of a woman, but every now and then, there was a crack in the wall, a strange, buried flirtatiousness that came out sideways. Luke was quiet, but he was observant. He noticed everything. He noticed how, when she thought he wasn't looking, her face would soften. He noticed she kept one of the 2 chairs at the table permanently turned toward the window, as if expecting an arrival, or dreading one. He noticed the deep, angry-looking scar on her left forearm, just below the elbow, which she quickly covered with her sleeve when she saw him looking. And he noticed her loneliness. It was a tangible thing in the small cabin, as real as the dog and the fire. She talked to Grit, her voice low and conspiratorial. "He'll be gone soon, boy," she'd murmur, scratching the dog's ear. "Then we'll have the place to ourselves again." In the evenings, when the light failed and the storm seemed to settle in for a long siege, she would sometimes take a worn book from a shelf, Shakespeare, and read aloud. Her voice, so rough in conversation, would smooth out, and she would lose herself in the words, her fingers tracing the lines. She was reading for herself, or perhaps for the ghosts in the room. But Luke listened, sitting on his cot, pretending to mend his glove. The town, whichever one was closest, clearly left her alone. No one came to check on her, not even in this storm. Luke had been a cowboy long enough to know how whispers worked. A woman alone, a homestead this isolated, there was always a story, and the stories were rarely kind. This story, the narrator knew, was particularly cruel. Clara Hayes was 30 years old, but she had been married at 16 to a man nearly 3 times her age, Silas Hayes, a man known for his wealth, his land, and his controlling, jealous rage. He was cruel, the whispers in town said, and he kept her like a prisoner on this homestead. Then, last winter, in a storm just like this one, Silas Hayes had died. He was found frozen in the snow, not 50 feet from his own front door, a half-empty bottle of whiskey clutched in his hand. The town had opinions. Some said he got drunk and fell. Others, the women who had seen the bruises on Clara's arms in the rare times she came to town for supplies, said she'd locked him out. They said she'd listened to him beg and had simply sat by the fire, letting the storm do the work she hadn't the courage to do herself. They called her the Ice Widow. Dangerous. Cursed. Luke knew none of the details. He only knew what he saw. A woman who was braced for an attack. even in her own home. They avoided the past. They never asked, "Where are you from?" or "Who did you leave behind?" Their silences were long, stretching for hours, but they were never empty. They were filled with the howl of the wind, the crackle of the fire, the scraping of a spoon in a bowl, the sound of two people breathing in a space that was shrinking by the day. On the fourth night, the storm showed signs of breaking. The wind had died down, and the snow fell softly, vertically. The cabin felt intensely quiet, the silence inside suddenly louder than the storm had ever been. Luke was on his cot, his back against the wall, his ankle propped up. He was watching the fire, but he was aware of her every movement. The air was charged. Clara finished cleaning the supper dishes. She wiped her hands on her apron, then unhooked it and hung it on a peg. She moved to the hearth, into the pool of warm, orange light. Luke watched. She paused, her back to him, and seemed to listen to the new quiet. Then, slowly, she reached up and pulled the pins from her hair. It fell in a heavy, dark wave, cascading past her shoulders, almost to her waist. It was thick and beautiful, and held a surprising amount of red in the firelight. She picked up a wooden brush from the mantel. She did not look at him, but she knew he was watching. He could see the tension in her shoulders. She was performing. For him. For herself. She began to brush. Long, slow strokes from crown to tip. The sound of the bristles through her hair was a soft, rhythmic shush in the quiet room. Luke's mouth was dry. He did not move. He did not breathe. He just watched the firelight play on the strands of her hair, watched the curve of her back under the wool dress. It was the most intimate thing he had ever witnessed. She stopped brushing. Her hand, holding the brush, rested on her lap. She sat very still for a long moment. Then, she turned her head, looking at him over her shoulder. Her face was half in shadow, her eyes glittering in the light of the fire. A small, knowing smirk touched the corner of her mouth. It was not a kind look, nor a soft one. It was a look of challenge, of hunger, and of profound, aching loneliness. Her voice was low, rough, and it cut through the silence of the cabin. "No man has touched me in a year." The words hung in the air. It was a confession. It was an invitation. It was a warning. Luke McCall did not answer. He couldn't. He just held her gaze. The blood was pounding in his ears. A heavy drumbeat that matched the slow pulse of the fire. Something shifted in the room's warmth. The air, already too close, became thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. She kept looking at him, that smirk still on her lips. And neither of them looked away. The silence that fell after her words was heavier than the snow piling against the door. Luke said nothing. He simply watched her, his gaze steady, unblinking. He gave her no judgment, but he offered no comfort either. He was a stone wall, and she had just thrown herself against him. Clara held his gaze for another long moment, the smirk hardening into something brittle. Then, with a little toss of her head, she turned back to the fire, picked up the brush, and began her strokes anew, this time with a sharp, angry rhythm. The spell was broken. Luke let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the sound of it lost in the sudden, renewed shriek of the wind outside. Days passed. The storm did not break. It merely paused, took a breath, and settled in for a siege. The world became a monotonous, unending landscape of white and gray. The snow piled in great, sculpted drifts against the cabin, burying the porch and rising halfway up the single window. They were trapped, not just by the weather, but by each other. Luke's ankle healed slowly. The sharp, stabbing pain faded to a dull, persistent ache. He refused to be idle. He spent the first day of his recovery reinforcing the crude seals on the window frame, packing them with rags and moss he found in the shed. The work was small, but it kept his hands busy. By the fifth day, he insisted on going outside, despite Clara's terse warning that he was a fool. He had found a stack of seasoned pine posts and rails in the half-buried shed, clearly intended for a project long abandoned. The existing fence for the small paddock was a wreck. Mostly just wire and hope. A fence needs to be built proper, he'd said, his voice quiet. Something that'll hold. Clara had just watched him, her arms crossed. Hold what? Nothing comes out here but wolves in the wind. It's about the work, he'd replied, and limped out into the biting cold. He began digging post holes in the frozen, snow-covered ground. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. He would heat the tip of a long iron bar in the fireplace, carry it out, and use it to chisel at the earth, the thud and tink of it echoing in the muffled air. Then he would scoop out the loosened dirt and ice, his hands, even gloved, turning stiff and blue. Clara watched him from the window, her face unreadable. She watched him fight the ground, watched the set of his jaw, the solid, unyielding line of his back. He was a quiet man, but there was a stubbornness in him that matched the landscape. He was building a fence against the wilderness, and she felt uneasily that he was also building one inside the cabin. But the shared confinement, the endless hours trapped by the fire, began to wear down her defenses in a way the wind could not. The silence needed filling. One afternoon, while Luke sat near the hearth oiling the rifle he'd insisted on retrieving from the shed, Clara's gaze drifted to a dark, tarp-covered shape in the far corner of the room. It was the one thing Luke had not investigated. "My mother sent that," she said, her voice startlingly soft. Luke stopped rubbing the cloth over the gunmetal. "It came all the way from St. Louis, on a wagon train. Silas, my husband, he said it was a waste of space, a foolishness." She walked over and, with a sudden, decisive movement, pulled the tarp away. It was a piano, a small upright, its dark wood finish scarred and clouded. Several of the ivory keytops were missing, yellowed like old teeth. "I used to play," she said, her fingers ghosting over the silent keys. "Back home, I was good. I was going to go east, to Boston. I had a cousin there. She said I could teach music. I dreamed of it." She pressed a key. It made a dull, tuneless clunk. "He didn't like the sound," she said, her voice hardening. "Said it was noise. Said a wife's hands were for kneading dough and mending, not for making a racket." She looked at her own hands, strong, chapped, the knuckles red. "He was right about that. I suppose they're not music hands anymore." She dropped the tarp back into place. The piano disappeared. "He ended those dreams," she said, turning her back to him. "He ended a lot of things." Luke said nothing. He just went back to oiling the rifle, the rhythmic scrape of the cloth the only sound in the room. He offered no pity, no shared stories of his own. Clara found his silence more unsettling than any questions would have been. He was a locked box. He ate, he worked, he slept on his cot, and he said almost nothing about the world he'd come from. But she was observant. She saw the things he tried to hide. She saw it in the way he flinched. A log splitting in the fire with a sharp crack would make his shoulders bunch, his hand instinctively dropping to the handle of the knife on his belt. He never sat with his back to the door, always choosing the cot or the chair that faced the entrance, his eyes constantly scanning the threshold. And she saw it in the dead of night. She was a light sleeper, a habit learned from years of listening for a heavy, drunken footstep. She woke one night. The fire burned down to a deep, pulsing bed of red embers. The wind had quieted, and the cabin was utterly still. She turned her head and saw him. He was not on his cot. He was sitting on the floor before the hearth, his knees drawn up. He was not asleep. He was staring into the coals, his face illuminated in the dull, hellish light. In his hand, gripped so tightly his knuckles were white, was the long, heavy iron fireplace poker. He wasn't holding it like a tool. He was holding it like a weapon. His gaze was distant, his face rigid with a tension that frightened her. He was not in her cabin. He was somewhere else, somewhere cold and dark, and he was terrified. She held her breath, afraid to move. The dog, Grit, let out a low, sleepy whine from the foot of her bed. Luke's head snapped toward the sound, the poker rising an inch. His eyes were wide, vacant, and for a second, she was certain he did not see her. He saw a threat. "Luke?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. His name seemed to pull him back. He blinked, the tightness in his face loosening. He looked at the poker in his hand as if surprised to find it there, then slowly, deliberately, placed it back on the hearthstones. "Just cold," he mumbled, not looking at her. He pushed himself up, his stiff ankle protesting, and retreated to his cot, turning his face to the wall. Clara lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of his breathing. He was a man carrying ghosts, and they were far more dangerous than the ones she knew. The breaking point came 2 nights later. The storm had returned with a vengeance, rattling the very logs of the cabin. The confinement was becoming a sickness. They had eaten their supper of salted pork and beans in near total silence. Luke was cleaning his knife. Clara was mending one of her thick wool stockings. The quiet was heavy, suffocating. "He hated the wind," Clara said suddenly, her voice loud in the small space. Luke looked up, his hands still. "Silas," she said, clarifying. "My husband, he said it sounded like witches. He heard things in it, accusations. He drank to drown it out, but he always heard them." She put the stocking down, her hands nodding in her lap. She was staring at the wall, but Luke knew she was seeing something else. "He was an old man, you know," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He wanted a young wife, a son. I was 16. My father had debts, so he sold me for 24 head of cattle and $50. Luke remained perfectly still, watching her. "The last night, it was a storm like this one, exactly like this one. He'd been drinking for a week. He grabbed me. He tore my dress." She touched her shoulder, a phantom memory. "He said I was unclean, said I was smiling at that trapper who passed through last month. He accused me of wanting other men. He said he could smell it on me." Her breath hitched, but she did not cry. Her eyes were dry and bright. "He dragged me to the door. He said if I wanted to be a whore in the snow, I could go be one, and he threw me out, right out there." She pointed to the door. "Locked it, barred it. I had nothing but my nightgown." Luke looked at the door, then back at her. "It was cold," she whispered. "Colder than this. I screamed for a long time. I beat on the door until my hands were bleeding. I begged him. He just laughed. I heard him through the wood. He was laughing and then he was coughing. A terrible, wet sound." She looked down at her hands. "I sat against the door. I thought I was going to die. I got so cold I couldn't feel anything. I just waited. The wind was so loud. And after a while, I didn't hear him coughing anymore. I didn't hear him laughing. I didn't hear anything." She paused. The only sound the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. "I must have fallen asleep. Or fainted. I woke up when the sun rose. It was quiet. The storm had passed. I was frozen to the porch. I had to break my hair free. It was frozen to the boards. I tried the door. It was still barred. I went to the shed." She continued, her voice a monotone. "I got the axe. I broke the window. I climbed inside. The cabin was freezing. The fire was dead. He was on the floor. Right there." She pointed to a spot near the table. "He had fallen. The whiskey bottle was empty. His eyes were open. He was frozen. Just frozen solid." She finally looked at Luke. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, waiting for the judgment he held. "I sat down at the table," she said, "and I waited. I waited until the fire was out and I was so cold I couldn't feel my feet. Then I got up. I built a new fire. I made coffee. And I never called for help. I left him there for 2 days before I rode to town and said I'd found him in the snow." The cabin was silent. Clara was trembling, the confession having taken the last of her strength. She expected him to move away, to look at her with the same disgust the townspeople did. Luke watched her for a long time. He set his knife down carefully on the cot. He looked at the floor where she had pointed, then at her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, rough, but devoid of judgment. "Some men," he said, "deserve to die alone." Clara's breath shuddered out of her. It was absolution. It was the one thing she had never expected. She stared at him, and for the first time, she did not see a stranger. She saw an ally. The tension in the cabin changed after that. It was no longer the sharp-edged wariness of two strangers. It was something heavier, thicker. The air hummed with their shared secrets, with the unspoken truth of what they had both survived. They began to move around each other with a new, dangerous awareness. When they washed the dishes, their hands would brush in the gray, soapy water of the basin. Luke's fingers were calloused, hard. Clara's were strong, but the skin was softer than he'd expected. They would both pull back immediately, as if burned. They sat by the fire, the space between them shrinking. Luke would be working on a piece of harness, and Clara would be reading. But neither was focused. Luke was aware of the scent of her, soap and wood smoke and something uniquely female. Clara was aware of the heat rolling off him, the solidness of his presence. The thaw came inside, while the world outside remained frozen. One night, Luke woke from a nightmare. He sat up with a gasp, his hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. His heart was hammering. He was covered in a cold sweat. "Micah," he breathed, the name a wound. He heard a sound. Clara was sitting up in her bed, watching him. The moonlight, filtering through the snow-caked window, cast a pale, ghostly light over the room. "Your ghosts again?" she asked, her voice soft. He nodded, unable to speak. She got out of bed. He tensed. She walked not to him, but to a small chest, and pulled out a dark bottle and 2 tin cups. "My husband's," she said, her voice laced with irony. "He always said it was too good for sharing." She poured 2 fingers of whiskey into each cup and handed one to him. She sat on the chair near the hearth, not on her bed. She was giving him space. They drank in silence. The whiskey was strong, burning a path down his throat, settling a welcome warmth in his belly. It quieted the shaking in his hands. He used to hit me," she said quietly, staring into her cup. "When he was drunk, he liked to show me who was stronger." Luke looked at the scar on her arm, now visible in the moonlight. "He never hit me," Luke said, his voice a low growl. "My father, he just left. My brother wasn't so lucky." It was the most he had ever offered about himself. Clara looked at him, her eyes dark pools of shadow. The whiskey, or the late hour, or the shared confession had lowered her walls. She stood up. She walked over to him, standing before his cot. Luke looked up at her. She was tall, and she seemed to block out the moonlight. She reached out, her fingers hesitant, and touched his face. Her hand was calloused, but her touch was trembling. She traced the line of his jaw, rough with a week's worth of beard. "You're just a boy," she whispered, her voice thick with a sadness that had nothing to do with him. Luke's hand came up, covered hers, pressing her palm against his cheek. He closed his eyes. Her skin was warm. He felt the pulse in her wrist, a frightened, rapid beat. Clara leaned down. She was going to kiss him. He knew it. He waited, but she hesitated. Her lips hovered over his, so close he could feel the warmth of her breath. And then, in a gesture of profound, aching tenderness and deep uncertainty, she pressed her lips briefly, chastely, to the rough stubble on his jaw. It was a touch that was almost painful in its gentleness. It was gone as quickly as it came. Clara pulled her hand from his, her face tightening, and she retreated. She fled back to her bed, pulled the blankets up to her chin, and turned her back to him, her shoulders rigid. Luke sat on his cot, the spot on his jaw burning. He finished the whiskey in one swallow, the fire in his gut now a cold, tight knot. The next morning, the cabin was freezing with a new kind of cold. Clara was up before him, her movements sharp, angry. She avoided his eyes. She spoke only to Grit. Her voice clipped. "Move! Dog! Out of the way!" She seemed furious, with him, with herself. Luke felt a familiar, restless anger rising in him. The feeling of rejection, of being pushed away, was an old one. He pulled on his boots, grabbed the oilskin slicker, and went outside without a word. The air was frigid, the sky a low, oppressive gray. He went to the woodpile. He picked up the heavy splitting axe. He did not just chop wood, he attacked it. He brought the axe down with a grunt, splitting a thick log of pine in one clean blow. He set another, thwack, and another, thwack. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy. He put his healing ankle to the test, pivoting on it, putting his full weight into every swing. He was trying to exorcise the night, the whiskey, the feel of her lips on his skin, the ghosts in the cabin, the ghosts in his head. He chopped until his shoulders screamed, until his lungs burned, until sweat was pouring down his face despite the freezing temperature. He didn't stop when his hands, raw from the cold and the work, began to blister. He didn't stop when the blisters broke. He kept going, the thwack of the axe the only sound, a counterpoint to the pounding in his head. He chopped until his hands were raw and bleeding, the slick handle of the axe staining dark red. He was leaning on the axe, his chest heaving, when the shed door creaked. Clara was standing there, watching him. She had a small tin in her hand. Her face was pale, her anger from the morning gone, replaced by something he couldn't read. She walked toward him slowly, her boots crunching in the snow. She stopped just in front of him. She looked at the bloody axe handle, then at his torn, bleeding hands. "You're a fool," she said, but her voice was not sharp. It was soft. She reached out and took the axe from his numb grip, letting it fall silently into the snowdrift. Then she took his hands. They were huge, covered in blood and grime. She held them, her own smaller, warmer hands cradling his. "I didn't mean to scare you," she whispered, her eyes fixed on his ruined palms. Luke looked down at her, at the dark hair pulled back from her face, at the pale column of her throat, at the mouth that had touched him. All the tension, the anger, the nights of listening to her breathe, the days of watching her move, the whiskey, her confession, his own damned loneliness. It all broke at once. He reached out, his bloody hand grabbing her shoulder, and he hauled her toward him. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was not the tender kiss she had given him. It was a kiss of desperation, hard and rough and hungry. It was a violation of the silence, a breaking of the truce. It was all his frustration and all his need, and for a second, she was stiff, shocked. Then, with a small, broken sound in her throat, she kissed him back. Her free hand came up, tangled in his hair, pulling him closer. Her mouth opened under his, and the kiss deepened, turning from anger to a raw, desperate hunger that matched his own. It was a drowning man's kiss, a starving man's first meal. The world shrank to the taste of her, the feel of her body pressed against his. A sudden, savage bark shattered the moment. Grit! The dog was standing on the porch. His fur bristled, a low, menacing growl rumbling in his chest. He saw the violence of the embrace, the sudden shift, and he was ready to protect his mistress. Clara tore her mouth from his, her eyes wide, startled. She pushed against Luke's chest, pulling away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "No!" she panted, looking at the dog, then at Luke. "Grit! Easy, easy, boy!" The spell was broken. Their intimacy, so raw and new, was shattered again. They stood in the snow, inches apart, breathing hard, staring at each other. Luke's hand was still on her shoulder, his bloody fingerprints a stain on her wool dress. Clara looked at his hand, then at his mouth. She backed away. One step, then another, grabbing the tin of salves she had dropped in the snow. "Your hands," she said, her voice a shaking whisper. "Go inside. Clean them." She turned and fled, disappearing into the cabin, the dog backing in after her, its eyes never leaving Luke. Luke stood alone by the woodpile, his hands throbbing, his body aching with a need that was now, finally, named. That night, neither of them slept. They lay in their separate beds, in the dark, listening. The snow had started again, a soft, insistent brushing against the window. But inside the cabin, the silence was a living thing. It was a coiled snake, a snow-covered world outside, and a burning house inside. The night that followed the kiss was a frozen purgatory. They lay separated by the 10 feet of dark, cold air. Yet the space vibrated. Every creak of the cabin logs, every shift of the embers in the hearth, every soft sigh from the dog. Grit was magnified. Luke lay on his cot. The bandages Clara had wrapped around his raw hands pulsing with a dull ache. She had come back out, her face a pale mask in the twilight, and had cleaned his wounds with whiskey and wrapped them in clean linen. She had done it with a grim, silent efficiency, her fingers never trembling, but her breath held tight in her chest. Neither of them had spoken a word. Now, in the dark, Luke stared at the ceiling. The image of her face tilted up to his, the shock and the sudden, answering hunger in her eyes, burned into his mind. He had broken the truce. He had crossed a line, and the dog's bark had been the only thing that saved them both from whatever came next. Clara, in her bed, lay rigid, facing the wall. She was furious, not at him, at herself, for that 1 second, that single, terrible moment when he had grabbed her and she had not pushed him away. She had melted. After a year of ice, a year of holding herself together with spite and memory. She had leaned into him. She had wanted him. The shame of it felt hotter than the kiss itself. She was the widow Hayes, the town curse. She was not a woman who wanted, she was a woman who survived. But the road remained impassable. The world stayed white, and the kiss, having been shared, could not be taken back. It sat in the middle of the room, a new, dangerous piece of furniture that they both had to navigate. The next morning, the avoidance was painful, but the cabin was too small for it. They had to eat. The fire had to be fed. Chores had to be done. A strange, new routine began to settle over them, born of necessity and the shared, unspoken reality of what had happened. They began to work together. It was no longer her cabin and him as a guest. It was two people against the winter. When Clara needed bread, her back to him, Luke would find himself pausing in his task of mending a broken chair rung, just watching. He watched the strength in her arms, the shift of her shoulders, the way a loose strand of dark hair would escape her bun and curl against her neck. She would feel his eyes on her, a heat on her skin, and her hands would falter in their rhythm. When Luke came in from the cold, his arms full of the wood he had split, his face ruddy from the wind, Clara would stop her reading. She would watch him stack the logs, noticing the solid, quiet way he moved, the breadth of his shoulders beneath the worn flannel. He would turn, catch her gaze, and she would look away quickly, her cheeks flushing. Their bodies were in a constant, silent orbit. Brushing past each other to get to the water bucket was a study in electric tension. Their fingers would touch when she passed him a tin cup of coffee, and both would recoil, just slightly. They were a pair of magnets, pushing and pulling, never quite settling. The silence, once empty, was now full. It was full of questions, of apologies, of accusations, and of a raw, simmering need. She returned to her book in the evenings, reading Shakespeare aloud. But it was different. Before, she had been reading to herself. Now, she was reading for him. Her voice, when she read of lovers and loss, was richer, softer, and Luke listened. He sat on his cot, his bandaged hands resting on his knees, and he truly listened. He heard the longing in her voice, the parts of her that had dreamed of Boston and pianos. The storm had locked them in, but the kiss had locked them together. The walls of the cabin had become the walls of their own small, isolated world. There was no one else. One evening, the fire was burning low, the wind a soft moan rather than a shriek. Luke was staring into the embers, the same way she had seen him that night, but this time his face was not vacant. It was just sad. He looked young and terribly weary. Clara put her book down. The new intimacy, born of that shared fire and the unspoken pull, made her bold. She had shared her story, her shame. He was still a locked box. "Luke," she said softly. He looked up. "You never said, who did you leave behind? Who are you, Luke McCall, when you're not lost in a storm?" His body tensed. It was the question he always left before it could be asked. He'd pick up his pay, saddle his horse, and ride to the next territory, the next ranch, the next empty horizon. He looked at her clear, steady gaze. She was not asking to be polite. She was asking because she, too, had a past she had survived. She had offered him her truth. He owed her his. He looked away from her, back into the fire. "I left no one," he said, his voice low and rough. "No one. Living." He picked up a small stick from the hearth and began to trace lines in the ash. "His name was Micah. He was my older brother, by 3 years. Clara waited. She did not prod. She let the silence draw the story out of him. It was back in Missouri, 1864. The war was everywhere, not the real war, not the big battles, just the dirty war, bushwhackers, deserters, men who had forgotten what side they were on, or never cared. They were just hungry and mean. He stopped, the stick still in his hand. We had a small farm. Our father was long gone. Our mother had died of fever the year before. It was just me and Micah. I was 17. I thought I was a man. Micah was 1. He did all the worrying. They came at dusk. He whispered, his voice so quiet Clara had to lean forward. 6 of them. They wore pieces of blue uniforms and pieces of gray. They just looked ragged. They wanted food, whiskey, money. We didn't have much. It made them angry. Luke's knuckles were white on the stick. "Micah, he told me to hide. There was a root cellar, under the kitchen floor. A small door hidden under a rug. He shoved me down there. He said, 'Don't you make a sound. Luke, not a sound. No matter what you hear. You stay put.' He was trying to save me." Luke swallowed. The sound was loud in the quiet room. "So I did. I hid." I pulled the door closed over my head. I sat there in the dark, smelling the dirt and the potatoes, and I listened. His breath hitched. I heard them. I heard them breaking things. I heard them yelling at him. And I heard Micah fighting them. He was strong. He hit one of them. I heard a man curse. Then I heard a shot. He closed his eyes. Just one. And then it was quiet. For a minute. Then I heard them laughing. They stayed for an hour. They cooked the last of our chickens. I heard the floorboards creaking right above my head. I heard them talking. One of them said Micah was a fool. Then they rode off. He was shaking, a fine tremor in his hands. "The guilt," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "I stayed in that cellar." Luke breathed, his eyes still closed, locked in that dark, dirt-smelling memory. "He told me not to make a sound. I was so scared. I obeyed him. I stayed. All night, I didn't go up until the sun came through the cracks in the floorboards. I was a coward. I just hid. When I finally pushed the door open, he was right there, by the table. He'd fallen, almost on top of the door. I'd been hiding under my brother's body all night." He opened his eyes, and they were bleak, empty. "So I started wandering," he said, his voice flat, all the emotion gone, replaced by a cold, dead exhaustion. "I've been wandering ever since. I can't stay in one place. I don't deserve to. The one who survived. The one who hid." He finally looked at her, his face stripped bare, offering her all his shame. Clara sat still for a long time. The fire crackled, eating at the last log. She did not offer him pity. She did not tell him he was wrong. She had lived a life of judgment. She would not offer it to him. Instead, she moved. She slid off her chair and knelt on the hearthstones in front of him, on the floor where he'd sat with the poker. He flinched, not expecting her to be so close. She reached out and took his hand, the one that was less injured. His hand was large, calloused, the skin rough. She held it. Then, she did something that stopped his breath. She lifted his hand, turned it palm up, and pressed it flat against her chest, over her heart. She held it there with her own. He could feel the solid, steady beat of her heart through the wool of her dress. It was a strong beat, a survivor's beat. "I survived too," she whispered. Her gray eyes locked on his. "You hid. I did not call for help. We did what we had to do. And the world doesn't get to judge us for it." His fingers trembled against her. He felt the warmth of her, the life of her, beating against his calloused, empty palm. He saw in her eyes not a reflection of his own shame, but a shared strength. A terrible, hard-won understanding. He did not pull his hand away. She did not let it go. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire dying, the cabin growing cold around them. Finally, she let go. She stood up, her movements stiff. The room was dark now, the embers a dull red. The cold was creeping in. She looked at her bed. Then she looked at his cot. It was a thin, lonely-looking thing against the far wall. She turned back to him. He was still sitting on the floor, watching her. "The fire won't last the night," she said, her voice practical, but a slight tremor ran through it. It's cold. The floor is cold." He waited. "You can," she cleared her throat. "You can sleep beside me. Only warmth. Against the cold." It was a lie. A desperate, beautiful lie. They both knew it. The room was no colder than it had been any other night. Luke did not speak. He stood up. He was taller than her, and in the dim, red light from the hearth, he seemed to cast a shadow over her. He looked at her, at the invitation in her eyes, the fear, and the need that matched his own. He nodded. Just once. Clara turned and lit a single candle on the small table by her bed. The small, flickering flame pushed the shadows back, but it made them deeper, softer. She turned her back to him, a gesture of trust. He heard the faint sound of her fingers working the laces on the back of her dress. He stood by the cot, his heart hammering a heavy, slow beat, like a drum in the distance. He unbuttoned his flannel shirt, his bandaged hands clumsy. He pulled it off, baring his shoulders and chest to the cold air. Clara's dress loosened. It slipped from her shoulders, pooling at her waist. She stood in her thin cotton shift. She was trembling, not from the cold. Luke walked toward her. He stopped just behind her. He could smell the wood smoke in her hair. He reached out, his hand hesitating. He touched her shoulder, his fingers tracing the strap of her shift. She did not pull away. She leaned back, just slightly, her head tilting, resting against his collarbone. He felt the tremor that ran through her. He turned her slowly. Her eyes were huge in the candlelight, her mouth slightly parted. She was afraid, not of him, of this, of the wanting. "Clara," he whispered. It was the first time he had used her name. She reached up, her own hands trembling, and touched the bandage on his. Then she touched his face, her thumb brushing his lower lip. He bent his head and kissed her. It was not the kiss from the woodpile. There was no anger, no violence. It was slow. It was tender. It was a question and a prayer. It was filled with all the hunger of her year alone and all the years of his wandering. It was hesitant, at first, a cautious exploration. Her lips were soft, and she tasted of tea and salt. She made a small sound in her throat, a sound of surrender, and her arms went around his neck, pulling him down, her body pressed against his, and the thin cotton of her shift was no barrier at all. He felt the heat of her, the softness of her, and his own arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her, holding her tight against him. He carried her the one step to the bed and laid her down, following her, his body covering hers. Their first night together was not a storm. It was a thaw. It was slow and careful and full of a desperate, unspoken need. It was two people, scarred and guarded. Finally lowering their weapons, he undressed her in the candlelight, his bandaged hands clumsy, his touch reverent. He kissed the scar on her arm. He kissed the place on her shoulder he knew her husband had bruised. She trembled, not from fear, but from a need so profound it was almost painful. When he finally moved inside her, it was with a hesitation that was more intimate than any passion. It was a joining, A slow, tender, aching relief. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in. And for the first time since he had hidden in a dark cellar, Luke McCall felt like he was home. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his back. And for the first time since her husband had died, Clara Hayes felt warm. In the morning, the world was transformed. The storm had broken. Bright, sharp sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the million dust motes dancing in the air. The cabin was quiet, peaceful. Luke woke first. He was on his back, and Clara was curled against his side, her head on his chest, her breathing deep and even. Her arm was slung across his waist, holding him. Her face, in the clear morning light, was soft, the hard lines of worry and suspicion erased by sleep. She looked younger. She looked happy. He lay still, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. He had never woken up with a woman in his arms. He had never felt this, a quiet, a stillness in his soul. She stirred, her eyelashes fluttering. She opened her eyes, and for a long, clear second, she looked at him with no armor. There was only a sleepy, vulnerable warmth. Then, memory returned. Her eyes widened slightly, and she tensed, as if to pull away. Luke's hand came up, gently, and settled on her hair. "Mornin'," he whispered. She relaxed, just a fraction. She looked at him, really looked at him. The man who knew her secret, and who had shared his own. The man who had touched her with tenderness, not violence. He smiled, a small, unused expression that lit his eyes. "You don't scare me, Clara." Her breath caught. He was telling her it was all right. He was telling her that her past, her widowhood, the rumors, the death, none of it mattered. A tear welled in her eye, spilling over, tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She looked at this new, fragile thing they had built in the night, this warmth, this peace. It terrified her more than any storm. "I scare myself," she whispered, but their quiet happiness, born in the darkest part of the winter, was short-lived. Luke untangled himself gently and rose from the bed. He pulled on his trousers and walked, stiff-legged, to the window, stretching his back. The sunlight on the snow was blinding, a perfect, pristine white blanket that covered the entire valley. It was beautiful. He squinted, looking toward the line of pine trees at the edge of the clearing, and then he went still. "Clara," he said, his voice flat, the peace gone, replaced by the old, familiar tension. She sat up, pulling the blanket to her chest. "What is it? Get dressed." He pointed. In the new, clean snow. They were unmistakable. Tracks, a single set of boot tracks. They came from the thick cover of the trees, advanced about 50 yards, to a spot where a man would have a clear view of the cabin. The tracks stopped there, the snow packed down, as if someone had stood and watched for a very long time. Then they retreated, disappearing back into the pines. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching the cabin, and the tracks were fresh. The cabin was no longer a haven. The morning sunlight, so bright and clean on the fresh snow, felt like an accusation. It illuminated the tracks. Luke stood by the window for a long time, his body a rigid line of tension. The quiet peace of the morning, of waking in Clara's arms, had evaporated, leaving a cold, metallic taste in his mouth. Clara dressed quickly, her movements jerky. The fear was back, the hunted look he had seen when he first arrived. "Who?" Luke asked, his voice flat. "I don't know," she whispered, pulling her hair back into its severe bun, her fingers fumbling. "No one comes here, no one. Not since your husband died." Luke finished for her. He pulled on his own boots, his mind working. The tracks were deep, made by a heavy man. They were confident, coming close enough to see into the window, lingering, and then retreating. A man who felt he had the right. He was watching, Luke said. He stood there for a long time. "Watching what?" Clara asked, her voice rising in panic. "Watching us." Luke said. He picked up his shirt, the one from yesterday, and saw the small, dark stains of his own blood on the cuff. From his hands, he looked at Clara, at her pale, terrified face. "Go on with the morning," he said, his voice quiet, steady. "Make the coffee. Feed the dog. Act normal." "Normal?" She almost laughed. "Luke, there is a man." "He's gone now. He'll be back, or he'll send someone. I want to see who it is." He checked the rifle in the corner, slid a cartridge into the chamber, and placed it near the door. He took his knife from his cot and slid it into the sheath on his belt. The morning dragged. Every gust of wind rattling the chimney sounded like a footstep. Every snap of the fire made Clara jump. Luke sat at the table, his bandaged hands resting flat, his eyes on the window. He was a coiled spring. They did not talk about the night. They did not talk about Boston. The intimacy they had shared was a fragile, warm thing, and the cold reality of the tracks had already put a frost on it. It was just past noon when Grit let out a low, deep growl, his eyes fixed on the door. Luke was on his feet in an instant, moving to the side of the window, the rifle in his hand. "Stay back," he told Clara. He heard the jingle of harness, the soft crunch of horses, more than one, in the deep snow. A moment later, 3 riders emerged from the pine line. They were not moving fast, not threatening, just arriving. "I know him," Clara breathed, coming up behind Luke, her hand gripping his arm. "The one in the lead, that's Tom Whittle." The man she indicated was broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy buffalo coat. He sat his horse with an air of careless ownership. The 2 men behind him were leaner, rougher, and they stayed slightly back, their hands never straying far from the pistols on their hips. They stopped 20 yards from the cabin. Tom Whittle dismounted, his boots sinking deep. He smiled, a wide, confident expression that did not touch his cold, blue eyes. "Clara, my dear," he boomed, his voice falsely cheerful. "The storm's broke, and the whole town's been worried sick about you. We were drawing straws to see who'd ride out and dig you out." He trudged toward the porch, brushing snow from his coat. Luke did not move from the window, the rifle held low, out of sight but ready. "We're fine. Tom," Clara said, her voice strained. She stepped away from Luke, opening the door just a crack, the way she had for him. "Just fine?" Tom Whittle stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his smile fading slightly as he took in her coldness. His gaze flickered past her, into the dimness of the cabin. He saw Luke. His eyes narrowed. The fake cheer vanished, replaced by a quick, assessing curiosity. He took in Luke's worn clothes, his youth, the bandages on his hands. His gaze flicked to the single bed, then back to Luke. "Well, now," Tom said, his voice dropping, taking on an oily, familiar tone. "Looks like you haven't been so alone after all." "This is Mr. McCall," Clara said, her voice like ice. "He was caught in the storm. He's been helping with chores." "Chores," Tom repeated, drawing the word out. He looked at the neatly stacked mountain of firewood Luke had split. "Looks like he's been very helpful." He put one boot on the step. "Aren't you going to invite us in? Clara, my men, they're half frozen. We're busy." Luke said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the air. Tom Whittle's head snapped toward him. The pretense of politeness was gone entirely. He looked Luke up and down. "And who are you, boy? The new man of the house?" "I'm the man telling you to stay off the porch," Luke said. Tom's face flushed a dull red. He looked at Clara. "You always were proud. Clara, even when you had nothing, Silas, God rest him, he knew how to handle you. Looks like you've forgotten your place." "This is my place," Clara said, her hand tight on the door. "And you're not welcome in it," Tom chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "We'll see. The sheriff, he's mighty interested in what goes on up here, mighty interested in how a lone woman survives. We were just checking on your welfare, that's all." He gave Luke one last, long, menacing look. "Seems your welfare is well in hand." He turned, trudged back to his horse, and mounted. "You take care. Clara," he called back. his voice booming again. "Town'll be calling on you soon." He and his men turned their horses and rode away, their backs rigid. Clara slammed the door and dropped the bar. She was shaking, her face white. She leaned against the wood, her eyes closed. "He was the one," Luke said. "This morning, those were his tracks." Clara nodded, her eyes still shut. "He was spying, to see if I was truly alone." "Who is he?" Luke demanded, setting the rifle by the door. Clara pushed herself away from the door and sank into the chair by the fire. She looked exhausted. "His name is Tom Whittle," she said, her voice dull. "His father owns the land that borders this. He courted me before Silas." Luke waited. "I was 16. He was persistent. He said he loved me, but he was like this, like he owned things, like he was owed." She rubbed her temples. "My father thought he was worthless, all brag, no acreage. Then Silas Hayes came along. Silas was old, but he was rich. He had the land, the cattle. My father, he made the choice for me. And Whittle, he never forgave me. He said I'd chosen an old man's money over him." She laughed, a bitter, dry sound. "When Silas died, Tom was the first one here. Before the sheriff even, he rode up, took his hat off, and told me how sorry he was." "And?" Luke prompted. "And," she said, looking into the fire, "he told me that a widow, especially a widow like me, couldn't survive alone. The town was whispering. He said I needed protection. He said he could provide it. He said he could take care of me, take care of the homestead. He wanted to take Silas's place." Luke said, "He wanted to own what Silas owned," she corrected, her voice hardening. "Including me. He said I owed him. He said I should have been his all along. He offered me his protection in exchange for obedience." "What did you do?" "I told him," Clara said, a faint, proud smile touching her lips, "that I would rather burn the cabin to the ground and dance in the ashes than be protected by him. I told him to get off my land and never come back." Luke looked at the door. "He came back. He's been waiting," Clara whispered. "Waiting for me to fail, waiting for me to be cold, or starving, or desperate enough to beg him for help. And instead, he finds you." Luke understood. This was not a neighbor. This was a spurned, entitled man. And Luke was not a traveler. He was a rival. "He'll be back," Luke said. It was not a question. "He'll be back." She agreed. The rest of the day was a long, slow crawl toward a night they both dreaded. The sun, which had been so bright, disappeared behind a bank of gray clouds. The world turned colorless again. Luke reinforced the door bar. He cleaned and oiled the rifle, and Silas's old shotgun he'd found in the shed. He laid out the ammunition. Clara cooked supper, but neither of them ate. They sat at the table, the stew cooling in their bowls, listening. The darkness fell heavy, thick and moonless. It happened around midnight. Grit, who had been sleeping uneasily by the hearth, sprang up, a low growl starting deep in his chest. Luke was already moving. Grabbing the rifle, Clara went to the fireplace, her hand closing around the heavy iron poker. "He's alone," Luke whispered, peering through a crack in the window shutter. "No horses. He's on foot." A heavy fist hammered the door. "Clara, open this door. I know you're in there. You damned witch, and I know you're not alone." It was Whittle's voice, thick with whiskey and rage. "Go away, Tom," Clara shouted, her voice trembling. "Not without him," he roared. There was a heavy, splintering crack as he threw his shoulder against the door. The bar held, but the wood groaned. "Get out, Cowboy," Whittle bellowed. "She's not for you. She's town property now, and I'm the town." He hit the door again, harder. Luke moved, standing to the side of the door, the rifle raised. "One more time, Whittle, and I'll put a bullet through the wood." Luke called out, his voice dangerously calm. There was a pause, a drunken laugh. "You won't shoot. You're just a drifter." "She's a murderess." You know what she did? She killed her husband, locked him out, let him freeze." Clara flinched as if struck. "The sheriff knows," Tom roared, his voice triumphant. I told him what I suspected. He's just waiting on a word from me. He knows she's a witch, a whore." He threw himself against the door again, and this time a hinge splintered. The door buckled inward. Luke didn't wait. He threw the bar, yanked the door open, and met Whittle as he stumbled in. Tom Whittle was not expecting it. He was holding a rifle, but it was pointed at the floor as he'd been using his shoulder. He looked up, his eyes wide with drunken surprise. Just as Luke hit him, Luke did not use the rifle butt. He used his fist. He hit Whittle hard in the jaw, a crack of bone on bone that sent the bigger man staggering back onto the porch. Whittle slipped on the snow, his rifle clattering to the boards. He was big, though, and the whiskey made him mean. He roared, scrambling for the rifle. Luke kicked it, sending it spinning into a snowdrift. Whittle lunged, grabbing Luke by the shirt, pulling him out into the freezing night. They crashed onto the porch, a tangle of limbs. Whittle was heavy, and he had the advantage of rage. He landed on top, his thick fingers finding Luke's throat. "I'll kill you," he spat, his face inches from Luke's, his breath a foul wave of whiskey. "I'll kill you and take her." Luke felt his air cut off. He saw Clara in the doorway, her face a mask of terror, the poker raised but useless, afraid to strike. This was not the root cellar. He was not a boy, and he would not hide. With a surge of cold, focused strength, Luke bucked his hips, unbalancing Whittle. He brought his knee up, hard, into Whittle's back. The man grunted, his grip loosening just enough. Luke twisted, his bandaged hands grabbing Whittle's wrists, tearing them from his throat. He rolled them over, slamming Whittle's head against the porch boards. He was on top now. He drew his arm back and hit Whittle again, and again. He hit him with all the cold rage he'd felt that morning, with all the desperation of a man who had finally found something and would not let it be taken. "Luke, stop!" Clara screamed. "Luke, you'll kill him!" Her voice cut through his rage. He stopped, his fist raised, his chest heaving. Tom Whittle lay beneath him, his face a bloody mess, his nose broken. He was conscious, but barely, moaning in the snow. Luke stood up, breathing hard. He looked at Clara. Her face was white, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. She was not afraid for him. She was, for a second, afraid of him. He turned from her. He grabbed Whittle by the collar of his heavy coat and dragged him off the porch, dumping him face first into the deep snowdrift where the rifle had gone. "Get up," Luke growled. Whittle sputtered, pushing himself up, spitting blood. "Find your rifle," Luke said, "and get off this land. If I ever see your tracks again, if I ever see you again, I won't stop." Whittle stared at him, hatred and fear warring in his drunken, broken face. He scrambled in the snow, found his rifle, and staggered to his feet. He limped away, holding his side, disappearing into the blackness of the pines. Luke watched him go. Then he walked back into the cabin and quietly barred the broken door. Clara had not moved. She was still standing by the hearth, the poker in her hand. She was shaking so badly the iron rattled against the stones. He's gone," Luke said, his voice still rough. "For now," Clara whispered. She dropped the poker. It clanged loudly. "He won't stop. He'll go to the sheriff. He'll tell them you attacked him. He'll tell them. God, he'll tell them everything." She looked at Luke, her eyes filled with a terrible, final despair. "They'll never stop. Not now, not until I'm ruined. Or gone, or dead." Luke went to her. He gently took her trembling hands. "Then we leave," he said. She looked at him, uncomprehending. "We leave," he repeated, his voice firm. "Together. We pack what we can carry. We'll head east. You wanted to see Boston. We'll go to Boston." A sound burst from Clara's throat. It was not a cry. It was a laugh. A short, bitter, heartbreaking laugh. "Oh, Luke," she said, pulling her hands free. "You're a fool. A sweet, brave fool. You think it's that easy? You think we just ride away? Yes. No, she said, her voice rising. I am Clara Hayes, the Ice Widow, the Town Witch, the woman who killed her husband. Do you think that name just stays here? It'll follow us. Every town, every stop. They'll look at me. They'll know. And they'll look at you. She gripped his shirt, her knuckles white. You'll get yourself shot protecting me. Is that what you want? To die for the Town Witch? For the whore who let a drifter into her bed? Yes, Luke said, his voice quiet, unwavering. If that's what it takes. He put his hands over hers, stilling their trembling. I'm not that boy in the cellar. Clara, I'm not hiding anymore. And I am not leaving you here. She stared at him, her desperate, bitter anger breaking against the simple, solid wall of his resolve. She saw he meant it. He would not run. He would not abandon her. He was tying himself to her shame, to her past. They'll hunt us, she whispered. Then they'll have to be fast, he said. We'll leave before dawn. We'll head east, but we'll stay off the main roads. For 2 days, they packed. The cabin, once a haven, became a place of frantic, quiet preparation. They were a team, bound by a shared enemy and a desperate plan. Clara packed dried meat, flour, coffee, and salt. Luke cleaned the guns, filled the ammunition belts. He repaired the broken door hinge, not to stay, but to slow anyone who followed. They worked in silence, their bodies constantly moving around each other. A new, tense intimacy. They watched the road. Every shadow, every gust of wind was a threat. They planned to take Clara's 2 sturdy mules. They would be slower than horses, but they were pack animals, built for hardship. On the final night, everything was ready. 2 canvas bundles sat by the door. The cabin was stripped bare, the ashes in the fireplace cold. It was a ghost of a home. The fear was thick, a physical presence in the room. They had not slept. They sat at the table, the single candle burning low, casting long, dancing shadows. We should go now, Clara said, her voice tight. Before the light. Soon, Luke said. He stood up. He walked to her. He held out his hand. She looked at it, then placed her hand in his. He pulled her to her feet. He did not kiss her. He just held her. He held her as if she were the last solid thing in the world. She buried her face in his chest, her arms wrapping around his waist, clinging to him. I'm scared, she whispered against his shirt. I know, he said, his hand stroking her hair. He led her to the bed. They lay down, still fully clothed, their boots on. But sleep would not come. The fear was too sharp. Luke shifted, turning to her. He kissed her. It was not the slow, tender discovery of their first night. It was not the angry, hungry kiss at the woodpile. It was fierce. It was desperate. It was a claiming. It was the act of 2 people who had nothing left but each other, and who knew, in the darkest part of their hearts, that this might be the last time. It was unguarded, and raw, and full of a terrible, aching sadness. It was a promise and a goodbye, all at once. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets, the cold air of the room biting at their skin. The candle had guttered, plunging the room into the faint, gray light of a moon hidden behind clouds. Clara was crying, not loudly, just a silent, steady stream of tears that he felt, hot against his neck. She turned her head, her lips brushing his ear. Her voice was a broken whisper, the sound of a woman who had given up all hope. Don't forget me, she breathed, her voice cracking. Don't forget me when they hang me. Luke's arms tightened around her, a painful, crushing grip. He felt her words like a blade in his gut. He thought of his brother, Micah, lying on the floor. He thought of his own cowardice. He thought of this woman, who had survived so much, only to be brought down by the whispers of bitter men. He pressed his face into her hair. His voice was a low, iron vow in the darkness. Then they'll have to hang me too. The promise of dawn was a pale, gray lie on the horizon. The cabin was cold, its fire dead, its soul packed into 2 canvas bundles by the door. Luke and Clara moved in the frigid, Still air, their breaths pluming. They had not slept. They were ghosts in their own short-lived story. Boots on, guns checked, ready to flee into the frozen, empty world. "It's time," Luke said, his voice a low rumble. He hefted one of the bundles. Clara stood by the door, her hand on the bar, her face pale and drawn in the dim light. She looked at the single bed, at the cold hearth, at the chair that faced the window. A home she had hated, then found life in, and was now leaving. She nodded. "The mules are ready." It was in that precise, suspended moment that Grit growled. It was not the sharp, warning bark of the night before. It was a low, deep rumble of inevitability. He was standing at the window. His fur bristled, his gaze locked on the pine line. Luke dropped the bundle. He was at the window in a second, pushing the shutter open a crack. His body went rigid. "Clara," he said, his voice flat. "Don't open the door. Stay away from the window." "Is it him?" she whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "It's him," Luke said, grabbing the rifle. "And he brought the law." She looked through the gray light. She saw them. 5 riders. Tom Whittle was in the lead, his face swollen and bruised, a white bandage stark against his jaw. But beside him, wearing a star on his heavy wool coat, was Sheriff Brody. And behind them, 3 deputies, rifles held easy across their saddles. They were not coming to talk. They were not coming to threaten. They were coming to end it. "Luke," Clara breathed, a terrible, cold calm settling over her. "It's done." "It's not," he said, his voice a low snarl. He chambered around, the snick of the rifle bolt loud in the stillness. "Don't," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Don't, Luke, not against the law. It's me they want. It's always been me. They're not taking you. Clara Hayes." The sheriff's voice was a deep boom that carried in the cold air. It was not an unkind voice, but it was a voice of finality. "Clara Hayes, I have a warrant for your arrest. Come out with your hands raised." Luke looked at her. Her face was a mask of utter despair. The vow he had made, "They'll have to hang me too," echoed in his mind. "We go out together," he said. He laid the rifle on the table. He took her hand. It was ice cold. He kicked the door bar up, and it fell with a heavy, wooden thud. He pulled the door open and stepped out onto the porch, pulling Clara with him. He stood in front of her, shielding her body with his own. The 5 men stopped, their horses steaming in the cold. Sheriff Brody looked at Luke, then at Clara hidden behind him. He looked at the packed mules. "Ma'am, I'm glad to see you're not harmed," Brody said, his eyes flicking to Tom Whittle. Whittle just smiled, a broken, triumphant sneer. "I'm not harmed," Clara said, her voice shaking. "And you have no business here, Sheriff." "I'm afraid I do," Brody said. He unrolled a piece of paper. "I have here a warrant, signed by Judge Miller, for your arrest on the charge of murdering your husband, Silas Hayes, and I have a sworn affidavit from Mr. Whittle here and 2 others, stating that you confessed the crime to this man." He squinted at the paper. "Luke McCall. And that Mr. Whittle overheard this confession while checking on your welfare." Clara gasped. "That's a lie. He's lying." "Furthermore," the sheriff continued, his voice heavy, "the warrant names this same Luke McCall for conspiracy and for the seduction of a widow under duress and for the brutal assault of Mr. Whittle." "He attacked us," Clara cried. "He broke the door. Look at it." "Ma'am, that's for the judge to sort out," Brody said, his patience wearing thin in the cold. He motioned to his deputies. "You're both under arrest." Luke did not move. He stood his ground, his hand still holding Clara's. "She's not going with you," he said. "Son," the sheriff said, his voice hardening. "I've got 5 guns here. You've got nothing. Don't make this harder. Step aside." "No!" Clara squeezed his hand. "Luke, please." "I said no." The sheriff sighed. "Amos, Jeb, go get them." 2 deputies dismounted. their rifles now held at the ready. They started toward the porch. Luke gently pushed Clara behind him. "This is your last chance. Son, stand down," Brody warned. The first deputy, Amos, reached the porch. He was a young man, nervous. "Sir, please, put your hands up." Luke looked at him. He looked at Tom Whittle, who was watching with hungry anticipation, his bruised face alight. He thought of Micah. He thought of the cellar. When Amos put a hand on his shoulder, Luke moved. He shoved the deputy. Hard. Amos stumbled back, tripping over the step and falling into the snow. The second deputy, Jeb, raised his rifle butt to strike. Luke turned, his fist lashing out, catching Jeb square on the jaw. The deputy dropped like a stone. "Damn it!" Brody yelled, fumbling for his own pistol. Luke turned, his eyes on Whittle. He was going for Whittle. He took one step off the porch. He never saw the blow coming. The third deputy, the one who had stayed with the horses, had circled around. He swung his heavy Colt revolver in a short, brutal arc. The barrel connected with the back of Luke's skull. There was a sound like a wet piece of wood splitting. The world exploded in white-hot pain, and then nothing. He collapsed face first into the snow, his hand ripped free from Clara's. "Luke!" Her scream was the last thing he had heard before the blackness took him. When he woke, the world was a lurching, agonizing wave of nausea and cold. His head throbbed with a pain so vast it seemed to have its own heartbeat. He was on one of the mules, his hands bound in front of him. His hair was matted and stiff with dried blood. He lifted his head, the world spinning. Clara was on the other mule, just ahead of him. Her hands were also tied. She was staring straight ahead, her back a rigid plank of ice. Tom Whittle rode beside her, talking, his voice low and smug. Luke couldn't make out the words. He only saw Clara's profile, pale and sharp as a shard of flint. Ignoring him, they rode into the town of Dry Basin as the sun was clearing the rooftops. The town was small, just one dusty, half-frozen main street, but it was awake. Whittle had clearly ridden ahead, or sent someone. The town was waiting. Faces appeared in the windows of the mercantile and the saloon. People stepped out onto the boardwalks, their morning coffee cups steaming in their hands. They stood, and they watched. As the small procession, the sheriff, his 3 deputies, and his 2 prisoners, moved toward the jailhouse. The watching turned to muttering. "That's her," a woman in a gray apron whispered, her voice carrying, "The Ice Widow. Killed him. She did," a man spat. "Let him freeze. Always knew she was no good." When they stopped in front of the small, squat stone building marked Jail, the crowd grew bolder. They pressed in, forming a small, quiet, ugly circle. "Get her, Sheriff!" a man shouted. A deputy pulled Clara from the mule. She stumbled, her hands bound, and nearly fell. Tom Whittle made a show of grabbing her arm to steady her. Clara ripped her arm away from him as if his touch were poison. This, somehow, ignited the crowd. "Whore!" a woman shrieked from the back. The word struck Clara like a slap. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and shame. "Murderer!" another man yelled. "Witch! Look at her, not even crying, cold as the ice she used to kill him." Then a man, one of Whittle's friends, the one who had been with him at the cabin, pushed through. He leaned forward and spat. The thick gob of tobacco landed on the hem of Clara's dress. Clara froze, staring at the brown stain. Luke, his head splitting, slid from his mule. He saw the spit. He saw her face. A raw, animal rage, born of helplessness and pain, tore through him. "You bastards!" he roared, lunging at the man. The deputies were on him instantly. One shoved him back, and the other slammed his rifle butt into Luke's stomach. Luke folded, gasping, the world going gray at the edges. "Get them inside, now!" Brody yelled, his face red with anger, whether at the crowd or at Luke. It was impossible to tell. They were dragged into the dark, cold jailhouse. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the shouts of the mob, but the sound of their hatred still seemed to leak through the stone. The jail was 2 cells, separated by a solid stone wall. facing a central corridor and the sheriff's desk. It smelled of stale sweat, cheap whiskey, and despair. "Put him in cell 1. Her in cell 2. Brody ordered. A deputy shoved Luke into the first cell and slammed the barred door. Luke collapsed onto the thin, filthy cot, his head in his hands, the pain and the rage making him sick. He heard them put Clara in the cell next to him. He heard the clank of the door, the finality of the lock. Tom Whittle lingered. "Thank you, Sheriff. You've done this town a great service. I've done my job." "Tom," Brody said, his voice heavy. He sounded tired. "Now get out. I've got prisoners to process." Whittle laughed, a low, satisfied sound. "I'll be seeing you, Clara," he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "We'll see who begs who next." Luke heard her spit. He heard Whittle curse. And then the heavy front door of the jail closed. Silence. Sheriff Brody sat at his desk with a heavy sigh. He poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and brought it to Clara's cell. He unlocked the door just long enough to hand it to her and to unlock her cuffs. "Drink," he said, not unkindly. Clara stood in the middle of the cell, her hands rubbing her raw wrists. She was shaking. "Sheriff," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "You know him. You know Tom Whittle. You know that was a lie." Brody rubbed the back of his neck. "Clara, what I know and what I can prove are two different things. He's got a warrant signed by the judge. He's got 2 witnesses who swear they rode with him and heard you confessing. They say this McCall was threatening you, and you told him you let Silas freeze, begging him not to hurt you. That's not... It's twisted," she whispered. "Maybe," Brody said. He looked at her, his eyes sympathetic. "I never liked Silas. No man in this town did. He was a mean, cruel drunk. But that don't matter. The law is the law. And the charge is murder." He went to Luke's cell, unlocked his cuffs, and shoved the pitcher and another cup through the bars. "Your head," he said, "is going to hurt for a week. You're charged with assault on an officer of the law. You're lucky Deputy Amos ain't pressing charges for that broken tooth." Luke just glared at him, his head pounding. Brody went back to his desk. "The circuit judge, Judge Hargrove. He'll be in Dry Basin in a week. He's a hard man, but he's fair. He'll hear your case then. Until then, you both stay here. After that crowd, it's probably the safest place for you." He settled into his chair, picked up some paperwork, and the jail fell into a terrible, heavy silence, broken only by the faint, muffled shouts from the saloon down the street as the news spread. An hour passed, then another. The adrenaline faded, leaving Luke with the agonizing throb in his head and the cold sickness of failure. He had let this happen. He had let them take her. He pulled himself to his feet, his muscles screaming. He walked to the back wall, the one that separated his cell from hers. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He heard a small, shuffling sound. "I'm here." Her voice came back, small and broken, muffled by the stone. "Clara," he said, pressing his forehead against the cold, damp rock. "Listen to me. When the judge comes, I'm going to testify." "No." Her voice was sharp with fear. "Luke, don't. They'll say what the warrant said. They'll say I seduced you. They'll twist it. They'll make you a liar and me a whore." "I don't care," he said, his voice raw. "I don't care what they call me. I'm going to tell them the truth. I'm going to tell them what you told me, about that night, about him locking you out. I'll tell them. Clara, I'll tell them I saw the scars, the ones on your back, your arms. I'll tell them what kind of man he was. I'll make them see." There was a long silence from her side of the wall. He heard a small, choked sound. "They won't listen," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "They want me to be a monster. Luke, it's easier than believing Silas was. I'll make them listen." He growled. I will not let him win. I won't let them win." They stayed like that, leaning against the dividing wall. 2 prisoners separated by a foot of stone, but closer than they had ever been. Days passed. The jail became their world. Brody was decent enough. He brought them stew from the hotel and kept the cell clean. The mob outside dissipated, but the hatred remained. Any time they were let out to use the outhouse, there was a deputy, and there were whispers. On the third night, Clara was lying on her cot, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think, not to feel. The jail was dark. The deputy on duty was an old man named Peters, who was asleep in the sheriff's chair, his boots up on the desk. Snoring, she heard a tiny scraping sound, not a rat. "Mrs. Hayes?" The voice was a tiny whisper. Clara sat up. In the faint moonlight coming through the barred window, she saw a small shadow. A child, a young girl, no more than 10, was pressed against the bars of her cell. It was Sarah, the blacksmith's daughter, a quiet, shy girl Clara had sometimes given rock candy to when she made the rare trip to the mercantile. "Sarah, what are you doing? You'll be in a world of trouble." I heard what they was shouting," the girl whispered, her eyes wide with fear and determination. "My PA, he said you were a bad woman, but they're liars." She shoved something through the bars. It was small, wooden, and velvet-lined. You gave this to me," Sarah whispered. "Last year, after my ma died, you came to the smithy. You said it played a song about spring coming." Clara's hand closed around it. It was a small, cheap music box. She had bought it from a peddler and given it to the grieving child, a simple, impulsive act of shared sadness. She had forgotten it completely. I can't let them be mean to you," Sarah said, tears in her eyes. This is to remember spring." The girl turned and fled, a shadow vanishing out the back door, which she had quietly unlatched. Clara stared at the box in her hand. It was the first act of kindness she had known from this town, from anyone but Luke, in her entire life. Her hands, rough and chapped, trembled as she fumbled with the small brass key on the side. She wound it. A faint, tinny, delicate sound filled the cold. Stone cell, a simple waltz, a song about spring, the armor she had worn on the ride to town, the ice she had built around her heart to survive the mob. It all shattered. She sank onto the cot, clutching the little box, and she wept. She wept for Silas, for Luke, for the lost years, and for the small, impossible kindness of a child. The next day, Sheriff Brody found her sitting quietly, the box on her lap. She seemed different, not broken, but hollowed out, and then filled with a new, cold resolve. "Sheriff?" she asked, her voice clear. "I need to write my statement for the judge. May I have a pencil? And some paper?" He looked at her, surprised by the clarity in her voice. He nodded and brought them to her. She sat on the cot, but she did not write a statement. She did not write about Silas or Tom Whittle or the law. She wrote a letter. She wrote to Luke, though she did not use his name. She wrote to the world. She wrote about the isolation. She wrote about the whispers. And then she wrote about him. I was a thing to be used, she wrote, the pencil scratching on the rough paper. A thing to be pitied and feared and hated. I was a ghost in my own home. I had not known a kind word or a gentle touch in so long I had forgotten they were real. And then a stranger came. He did not see the witch. He did not see the widow. He saw the scars, and he did not turn away. For the first time in my life, someone saw me without shame. In the next cell, Luke heard the sound of her writing. He heard the faint, occasional click as she wound the music box. He sat on his own cot, his head healing, his hands clenched. He thought of her tears. He thought of the mob. He thought of his vow. He pressed his face against the cold stone, his voice a low, raw promise to the wall, to her, to himself. They don't get to destroy you again, Clara. They don't get to win. I'll make them see. I swear it. I'll make them all see. The seventh day dawned iron gray and bitter cold. The trial was not held in the saloon, which served as a courthouse when the circuit judge was absent, but in the First Presbyterian Church, It was the only building in Dry Basin large enough to hold the entire town, and the only one deemed suitably solemn for a matter of life and death. It was packed. Every bench was full. The aisles crowded with men standing 3 deep, their hats clutched in their hands. They were not there for justice. They were there for the spectacle, for the final, righteous confirmation of what they had always known. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, stale tobacco, and cheap perfume. It was freezing. The small pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated a small circle of heat that reached no one. Luke and Clara were marched in by Sheriff Brody, their hands bound in front of them. A low, ugly murmur rippled through the crowd as Clara passed. "Witch!" a woman hissed, loud enough to be heard. "Murderess!" Luke felt Clara flinch beside him, but her head stayed high, her face a pale, cold mask. They were seated on a hard bench at the front, alone, a deputy on either side. At the front, on a raised platform usually reserved for the pulpit, sat Judge Hargrove. He was an outsider, brought in from Cheyenne, and he looked it. He was a thin, severe man with a face like cured leather, dressed in a black suit that was neat, but worn. His eyes were a pale, cold blue, and they missed nothing. He represented a law that was abstract, cold, and not swayed by the town's whispers. He scanned the crowd with open disapproval, then banged a wooden gavel. "This court is in session." His voice, dry and reedy, cut through the murmuring. "The Territory versus Clara Hayes and Luke McCall. The charges are murder, conspiracy, and assault. How does the town's attorney proceed?" The prosecutor, a young, ambitious man from the land office, stood up. But everyone knew he was just a mouthpiece. The real prosecution was sitting in the front row, his bruised face a mask of civic duty. Tom Whittle. Whittle was the first witness. He walked to the platform, his limp slightly exaggerated. His arm in a sling Luke knew was for show. He swore his oath, his eyes finding Clara's. "Mr. Whittle," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court what you observed on the night in question." Tom Whittle turned to the crowd, his voice full of false sincerity and sorrow. "I've known Clara since she was a girl," he began, his voice dropping. I cared for her. We all did." "We all worried about her. Married off so young to a hard man like Silas Hayes, a man with a known appetite for drink." He painted himself as the town's concerned shepherd. "After Silas passed, I made it my business to check on her. This winter, this storm, it was a bad one. I was worried. I rode out as soon as the snow broke, just to see if she needed supplies." He paused, letting the drama build. I got there, and I saw him." He pointed at Luke. "A drifter, a young, able-bodied man, and the atmosphere in that cabin. Judge, it was not right. It was intimate. She was different, flushed, happy. And what happened then? Mr. Whittle?" "I am a God-fearing man. Judge," Whittle said, placing his good hand over his heart. "I saw a widow in a compromised position. I offered her my help to get this man off her property. And she refused. She and this McCall, they were familiar. And the assault. I went back that night," Whittle said, his voice lowering with shame. I know, it was improper, but I had a terrible feeling. I thought he was taking advantage of her. I went to the door to plead with her, and he burst out. Like a madman. He didn't say a word. He just tried to kill me." He touched his bruised face. "He beat me, Judge, beat me senseless, for trying to protect her honor. And the murder charge, Mr. Whittle?" Here, Tom's face became a mask of profound, pained righteousness. "It was when I was on the ground, when he was beating me. I heard her yelling at him. She was hysterical. She shouted. Don't kill him like I killed Silas. Don't let him freeze like I did. She confessed it. Judge, right there. She let her husband freeze, and she was egging this new lover on to do the same to me." A collective gasp, ugly and satisfied, went through the church. Clara sat frozen, her face bloodless. "Liar," Luke breathed, so low only the deputy heard him. "Thank you, Mr. Whittle," the prosecutor said, sitting down. The judge looked at Clara. "Does the defendant wish to cross-examine?" Clara's lawyer, a man appointed by the court that morning, a drunk named Henderson, who usually handled land deeds, just shook his head. "The court calls Luke McCall," the judge said. Luke stood. The deputy unbound his hands. He walked to the platform, the throb in his head a dull echo of the rage in his heart. He did not look at Whittle. He looked at the judge. "Mr. McCall," the prosecutor said, "is it true you were intimately involved with the widow Hayes?" "I was," Luke said, his voice quiet, but it carried in the cold. Still air. "I came to her cabin half dead. She took me in when no one else would have. She fed me. She bound my wounds. And in return, you seduced her?" "No, sir," Luke said, his eyes finding Clara's. "We found a comfort. We are two people who have been alone for a very long time." "And did you hear her confess to killing her husband?" "No," Luke said. "What Mr. Whittle says is a lie." "Then why did you assault him?" "He came to the cabin drunk," Luke said, his voice flat. "He called her a witch. He called her a whore. He broke the hinge on her door, trying to get in. He threatened us. I defended our lives. I defended her." He turned, not to the prosecutor, but to the judge, to the town. "You want to know what happened in that cabin?" he said, his voice rising, a low, dangerous rumble. "I'll tell you. I saw a woman living in terror. A woman so alone she read books aloud to her dog. A woman who was so used to being beaten that she flinched when a man moved too fast." He pointed a finger, not at Whittle, but at the crowd, at the faces of the town. "You," he said. "You all knew. You knew what Silas Hayes was. You knew he was a cruel drunk. You knew he beat her, and you did nothing. You turned your backs. You let her rot up there, alone, on that mountain. You called her a witch because it was easier than calling Silas what he was. It was easier than admitting you were all cowards." "Objection!" the prosecutor shouted. "Mr. McCall," the judge said, his voice sharp, "you will answer the questions." "I am," Luke said, his gaze unwavering. "You want to know about her strength? Her strength was surviving you. Her strength was waking up every morning in that frozen, empty house, knowing the whole world hated her for a crime she didn't commit. She told me what happened. She told me Silas, in a drunken rage, accused her of cheating and threw her out into a blizzard. In her nightgown, he locked the door and he died of drink and exposure. She didn't kill him. He killed him, and you helped." The church was silent. The satisfied smirks were gone. People were looking at their feet. The women, in particular, looked uneasy. "And how would you know this?" the prosecutor sneered. "These fantasies of a desperate woman." "Because," Luke said, his voice dropping, "I saw the scars, old ones, yellow and purple, on her arms, on her back, from years of him, handling her. I saw them. Did any of you ever look?" He looked at Clara. Her face was buried in her hands. The prosecutor, seeing he had lost, sat down. The judge looked at his docket. "The court calls Sarah Johnson." A murmur went through the crowd. The blacksmith, Elias Johnson, stood up, looking pale. He helped his daughter, Sarah, to her feet. She was 9 years old, pale and trembling, clutching something in her hand. "Mr. Johnson," the judge said, "your daughter's name is on the witness list." "It's a mistake, Judge." Johnson stammered. "She's just a child. She don't know nothing. Let the child speak," the judge said, his voice softening for the first time. "Come here, little one." Sarah walked to the platform, her boots loud in the silence. She stood before the judge, her eyes wide. "Sarah," the judge said gently. "Do you know Mrs. Hayes?" Sarah nodded. "What do you know about her?" She's not a witch," Sarah whispered, her voice a tiny thread. "My PA, he said Everyone said, but they're liars. Sarah, her father hissed. They are, she insisted, her voice gaining strength. When my ma died, last spring, I was sad, and Mrs. Hayes, she came to the smithy. She had tears in her eyes too, and she gave me this. She held up the small, worn music box. She said it played a song about spring. She said, spring always comes, child, no matter how long the winter. She was nice. She was the only one who was nice. She looked at Clara, a look of fierce, childish loyalty. Clara was watching her, her hands gripping the bench, tears streaming silently down her face. The women in the crowd were no longer whispering. They were watching, their faces tight with a new, dawning shame. They remembered Clara, the quiet, haunted girl. They remembered their own silence. Thank you, child. The judge said, you may sit down. He looked at Clara. Mrs. Hayes, will you take the stand? Clara stood. Her legs were shaking, but she walked to the platform. Her lawyer, Henderson, looked up, surprised, as if he'd forgotten she was there. Mrs. Hayes, the judge said, you have heard the testimony? You have heard what Mr. McCall said. Is it true? Did your husband beat you? Clara looked at the judge. He did. Do you have proof? She does, Luke said from his seat. Make her show him. Clara looked at Luke, then at the judge. Slowly, her hands trembling. She turned her back to the crowd. She unbuttoned the high collar of her dress. She pulled the wool fabric down, past her shoulders, baring her upper back and arms to the cold air. The women in the front row gasped. Her skin, pale and white, was a road map of old pain, faded yellow-green bruises, small, puckered scars. A long, thin, white line on her shoulder blade. It was the gallery of Silas Hayes's rage. My God, Sheriff Brody whispered from the back. Clara pulled her dress back up, her movement stiff. She turned to face the judge. He was a monster, she whispered. And I was his. And that night, the judge pressed, his voice quiet. Did you lock him out? He locked me out, she said. He accused me. He dragged me to the door. I begged him. I beat on the door until my hands bled. Then I sat down to die. I woke up in the morning, and he was dead. I did not call for help. Her voice broke. I was so tired, and I was glad. God forgive me. I was glad he was dead. The confession hung in the air. Not of murder, but of relief. Mrs. Hayes, the judge said, his face grim. Do you have a final statement? Clara looked at the hostile faces. They were no longer hostile. They were ashamed, confused. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter she had written in the jail. The paper was creased. I wrote this, she said. It's my statement. She began to read. Her voice, at first, was a trembling whisper. I was a thing to be used, a thing to be pitied and feared and hated. I was a ghost in my own home. She looked at Tom Whittle, who was staring at his feet. I had not known a kind word, or a gentle touch. In so long I had forgotten they were real. Her voice gained strength. She looked at Luke. And then a stranger came. He did not see the witch. He did not see the widow. He saw the scars. And he did not turn away. For the first time in my life. Someone saw me without shame. He did not try to save me. He just saw me. She finished the letter. The church was so quiet. The sound of a single snowflake melting on the window pane would have been a roar. Judge Hargrove looked at the town. He looked at Clara. He looked at Luke. He took a long, slow breath. This, he said, his voice sharp and cold, is a failure. It is a failure of every person in this room. You sat by, wrapped in your own righteousness, and let a man abuse his wife. You let whispers and fear rule you. You turned a victim into a monster because it was convenient. He looked at Tom Whittle. You, sir, are a vulture, and your testimony is a self-serving lie, dismissed by this court." Whittle jerked as if struck. The judge turned to Clara. "Mrs. Hayes, you have endured a horror, but you, too, are not without fault. You did not call for help. You let your husband die, and you stayed silent. You took the law into your own hands by omission." He looked at his papers. "The charge of murder is dismissed. There is insufficient evidence of intent." This was, by all accounts, an involuntary death, brought on by drink and cold. The charges of conspiracy and seduction are patently ridiculous, and they are dismissed. Luke let out a breath he had been holding for a week. "Mrs. Hayes, you are a free woman." The judge said, "However," he paused, "this town has judged you, and they will not unjudge you. You will never know peace here, for your own safety, and for the peace of this community. I am ordering you to leave Dry Basin. You have 24 hours to settle your affairs and be gone." He banged the gavel. "The charges against Mr. McCall for assault are also dismissed, as he was clearly defending his person and property. This court is adjourned." It was over. No one moved. The town sat, stunned by the verdict, stunned by their own public shaming. Sheriff Brody unlocked Clara's cuffs, then Luke's. Luke stood. He took Clara's hand. It was cold. He pulled her to her feet. Without a word, they began to walk down the aisle. The crowd parted for them. No one met their eyes. They stepped out of the church into the cold, bright, unforgiving sunlight. They had won, and they had lost. They stood on the steps, breathing in the clean, free air. We're free," Clara whispered, as if she couldn't believe it. "Not yet." Tom Whittle burst through the church doors, his face a mask of purple, contorted rage. His public humiliation had broken him. "You!" he roared, his eyes on Luke. "You, drifter! You think you can come here and steal from me? You think you can shame me? You and your witch!" He lunged at Luke, his good arm pulling back to strike. Luke, weary, bruised, and drained, braced himself for another fight. A shot cracked through the air. It was deafeningly loud. It echoed off the storefronts and startled a flock of crows from the livery stable. Tom Whittle froze, his fist inches from Luke's face. Luke turned. Clara was standing there. She had taken the Colt from Luke's holster, which Brody had returned. She held the heavy revolver with both hands. The barrel pointed at the sky. Her face was calm, cold, and utterly transformed. The victim was gone. The townsfolk, spilling out of the church, stopped dead. They stared. Clara lowered the pistol, not at Whittle, but at the space between them. Smoke curled from the barrel. "Get away from him," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was not a plea. It was a command. Tom Whittle looked at the gun. He looked at her face, a face he had never seen before. He looked at the crowd, who were just watching. No one moved to help him. No one moved to stop her. They had seen the bruises. They had heard the letter. Their allegiance, built on whispers, had crumbled. Whittle swallowed, his rage turning to a sour, humiliated fear. He lowered his fist. He spat on the ground near Luke's feet. Then, without a word, he turned and pushed his way through the silent crowd, his reputation in ruins. Luke looked at Clara. She was still holding the pistol, her hands steady. He gently took it from her, his fingers covering hers. He slid it back into his holster. He held out his hand. She took it. They walked away from the church, away from the silent, staring town. They walked to the jail. Sheriff Brody met them, grim-faced. "Judge said you're free to go." He said. He handed Luke the canvas bundle of their supplies. "Your mules are at the livery, paid for." "Thank you, Sheriff," Luke said. Brody nodded, then looked at Clara. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, a gesture of respect he had never given her. I'm sorry." Clara just nodded. There was nothing left to say. They rode out of Dry Basin. They didn't look back. They left the whispers, the ghosts, and the cold, unforgiving valley behind them. They rode south, then east, toward a sun they hadn't seen in weeks. They settled across the state line, in a high valley that was warmer, shielded from the northern winds. It was a place where spring came early. They bought a small, broken-down piece of land with a creek, using the last of the money Clara had sewn into the hem of her dress. They worked, they built, they replaced the rotten logs of the cabin. They built a proper fence. Luke found work at a nearby ranch, breaking horses, his quiet, steady hands a balm to the wild animals. Clara planted a garden. One day, Luke returned from a trip to the nearest town, a 3-day ride. He was leading a wagon. In the back, covered in canvas, was a battered, scarred upright piano. He didn't say where he'd gotten it. He didn't say how. He just brought it. The final scene is not in winter. It is in late spring. The valley is alive, green and gold. The windows of their small cabin are open, letting in the warm breeze. Clara is at the piano. It is terribly out of tune, but she has been working on it. She is picking out a simple melody with one hand. The tinny, bright sound of the music box, Sarah's music box, sitting on top of it. Luke is not on a cot. He is resting on a proper bed, his boots off, his back against the wall, reading a book. The cabin is not empty. It is full of light, of peace. The tension is gone from his shoulders. The haunted look is gone from her eyes. She stops playing. The small, pleasant silence settles. She looks at him, and he looks up from his book. She reaches out, her hand, no longer chapped and raw, but strong and sure, covering his. He turns his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. She smiles, a real, slow, warm smile. 1 year without touch was long enough, she murmurs, her voice low, and full of a life he had never heard before. I'll never let go again. Thank you for listening to this story. We truly hope you enjoyed this tale from the American West. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment and say hello. For more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to From Wild West. And finally, if you enjoyed the story, please share your thoughts in English. We read every comment. Thank you again.